How will we power our future? Can we create a healthy and clean economy? Climate One at the Commonwealth Club is at the forefront of the global debate about energy, economy, and the environment. Bringing together the brightest and most provocative leaders of our time, Climate One is the place where big ideas get heard. With thoughtful and insightful discussions on policy, business, science, and culture, Climate One founder Greg Dalton gets to the heart of the matter. It's our future. It's time to come together.
As the global population approaches 8 billion, empowering women through access to education and family planning may be at the core of establishing a healthy balance for people and the planet. So why aren't we talking about it more? How big a role can gender equity play in reducing our global carbon footprint, and who gets to decide? A conversation on the power of gender equity with Ertharin Cousin, former executive director of the World Food Program, Musimbi Kanyoro, former president and CEO of the Global Fund for Women, and Corrine Sanchez, executive director of Tewa Women United. Up next on Climate One. Musimbi, I'd like to begin with you. In December of last year, you went to Antarctica on a group called Homeward Bound with about 100 women involved in science, technology, engineering, medicine, and math. And I'd like to hear about that journey, in particular, how it changed you, it inspired you, and whether you felt a little guilty going there to see the impacts of climate change firsthand in Antarctica.
The change for me was that I was at the intersection of changing from a life of being a full-time advocacy for women in the grant-making area in sexual reproductive health, as I worked with a foundation that worked on that before, and specifically also in the past working with girls. And I was trying to define for myself areas where I might lay a lot more emphasis, and had been working strongly with women who are interested in climate change, like Mary Robinson, for example, and wanted to create a place for myself to be active for climate change. And so that trip changed me. It told me that I can actually change the way of speaking and speak about how climate change has impacted the people in the place where I grew up, because I know it really well. I grew up where the rivers were flowing and we could see the water, and it's a farming area, and the farmers knew what seasons were going on, what seeds to plant and not to plant. And today that is not the case. So I joined many other grassroots women to be able to articulate in a language that people can understand about the impact of climate change, and not leave it very far up in such a way that not everybody understands what we're talking about.
Corrine Sanchez, activism kind of ignited, your activist path was ignited when you attended the Beijing Women's Conference in 1995. Tell us about that journey, and also if you felt like you were privileged to be there.
So for me, going to Beijing was an unplanned kind of event. Because of Tewa Women United, my mother and other women in our community who had been engaged in this work while I was away at school and college, they started Tewa Women United when I was graduating from high school. But to be able to come back during the summers and to see the power of women from my community, which is really has been impacted by colonialism and patriarchy, and to travel to Beijing, and I say this is where my fire for activism and finding my voice and really stepping into that light came as I witnessed thousands and thousands of women coming from all over the globe to just give voice to the concerns of their community. Stories of women that stayed for years and communities that raised money to send 1 or 2 delegates or representatives to that space was empowering. And for me as a young Indigenous woman who heard and understood genocide, the colonial history of our communities, the understanding of what that meant as far as impacts on economics, impacts on our access to health and education, what was taken away from our communities, our languages, and how that was related to environment. So coming from my Tewa community, my Tewa Toa community, it's about the wholeness. It's about the interconnection. It's about understanding what happens across the globe is a direct result of what we're doing here, and what happens there is a direct result of what we're experiencing. And growing up with that knowledge was hearing the stories and hearing the songs, right? And going to Beijing really was a politicizing moment for me because it expanded my circle. Like I understood that there was these levels of impact that we had, but going and hearing the stories of women that were sharing what was happening, the continued genocide that is happening in this world. People talk about it being over and done, part of history. But when we talk about the connections with our communities in South Africa, when we talk about our communities in the Philippines, the storing of the taking away of seeds of knowledge of that food sovereignty and seed sovereignty, and pushing monocropping and pushing that impact and what we know of how that impacts our climate and where we find ourselves. It was there that I realized that I did have privilege, even though I am a woman of color, even though I'm indigenous, even though I was young. There was still a lot of privilege that I was gifted with in some ways here in my community. And there was a lot of ways that oppression and racism and classism takes that away and takes our power and our voice. But going there and realizing that though I was a survivor of sexual trauma and violence, that there were women that faced immediate death and murder. And then also realizing, it took Beijing, but realizing that here now in the United States, that there are women and families, indigenous women, as well as African American women, our immigrant communities that face that imminent death, right? Because of these different systems and oppressions that are happening. But in Beijing, I saw the power of women being able to come together to really give voice on all levels, political, down to the mothers that were just trying to reclaim breastfeeding and reclaim birthing in their communities. And being able to bring that back to our community here and to really commit to that transformation that I witnessed in the stands, that I witnessed in the small classrooms of women gathering, and knowing that this responsibility lays within on my shoulders and also the generations to come.
Ertharin Cousin, where does your light and fire come from? You're the daughter of a community organizer and a social worker. Where does your light and fire come from?
I was born this way. I've always said there's a book inside me waiting to be written. Then the title of it is going to be "Born This Way." Growing as the oldest child of, as you note, a social worker and a community organizer, and I often say before Barack Obama made it popular. At an early age, it was important to my parents that their daughters understand that though we lived in the inner city of Chicago, we grew up in a community called Lawndale, which is on the west side of the city of Chicago, and lots of books have been written about the challenges of this community, that we were blessed with two parents who had the ability to educate us and to give us an understanding that we were in the community, but not of the challenges of that community. And so they often drove us to communities where people had more and communities where people had a lot less, to help us understand what disparities meant in real terms to real people, and to give us a sense of responsibility for not just self and family and community, but ultimately that grew into responsibility for nation. And as my experiences progressed, to global community, and recognizing that we have both the opportunity to and the circumstances that demand that we all work together to ensure that we can provide for the sharing of prosperity across racial lines, gender lines, and color lines. And that does not come unless each one of us accepts that responsibility.
Musimbi Kanyoro, when many people hear climate change, they think of a polar bear, maybe a coal-fired power plant, maybe a solar panel. They don't think of a woman carrying water or a woman in general. So help us understand the connection between climate and women's issues, women's education, and women's empowerment.
Those of us that are working now in the area of climate change have begun to use a frame of climate justice. And when we use the word climate justice, the really focus is to try to think about the people that are impacted by the climate change, so that we can be able to tell the story in such a way that people can actually associate it with something that they can identify with. So, for example, when things like climate change happen, the impact on there is a difference on how, or they impact people differently. Those who are vulnerable already, like poor, those who are women, those who are children, those who have disabilities, suffer in ways that are different from people who can mitigate these changes by themselves. And so when we talk about climate justice, we want to be able to help people focus on people and know that if we have to mitigate the kind of change that will make a difference, we have to actually look at inequalities that Ertharin and Corrine talked about. These inequalities make people experience vulnerabilities in different ways. And until we deal with those inequalities, our words will address only those that have possibilities to do something about it. And there are others who cannot do something about it. And so finally, I want to say that there are ways that we can talk about climate change by bringing it closer to the experiences of people, but also we can tell stories in different ways. We can tell stories in films, we can tell stories in podcasts, we can tell stories by bringing actually the actual people that have been impacted to tell their own story, and that is the loudest and the best way in talking about climate change, so that the scientists can be able to take this language of people and make it into a language that will engage people's emotions as well as people's intellectual thinking as well.
Ertharin Cousin, you've traveled a lot and talked to a lot of women, and as the former head of the World Food Program, what are some of the stories that you've seen that powerfully connect women's empowerment with climate resilience and climate justice?
When I was in South Sudan, after after it became South Sudan, and we were meeting with women in the fields who had migrated back from Sudan after that war, and we could talk a great deal about the conflict ongoing in South Sudan, but let's just talk about that period of time when there was hope and women were given equal access to the seeds, to the tools, to the financial support, as well as to the training that was necessary for them to plant and grow maize. They were so proud to have the ability to grow a crop with other women in their cooperative that for the first time gave them financial resources, which gave them voice in their households that they did not previously have, because they were able to bring money into the house. And they were able to their collective efforts to support the school fees that were necessary for their children, as well as addressing their own empowerment, as we like to say. And the women said to me, this was the first time that they felt listened to. But what we know is that the effects of climate change result in more erratic rains. And that same woman and her cooperative, who has the access to finances because she can grow a harvest. We've seen in subsequent periods no longer having the ability to have the resources that they need and being forced to stand in a line. And what my experiences tell me is that when we give women equal access to the training, to the tools, to the finances, that they will grow the food that is necessary to avoid their need to stand in those lines. But that means that we need more climate resistant, we need more drought resistant seeds. We need more research into agriculture that is smarter, that will ensure that when the rains affect the ability of the crops to grow, that we have early warning systems that provide for the type of changes that are necessary, that continue to ensure the ability of that woman, her community, to have the opportunity to provide for both her food security and the economic security of her family. I have never in all my training, all of my work, met a family who wanted to stand in a line for food. Everyone wants to feed their own children. But when the circumstances don't allow them the access to that opportunity, it requires that we provide the provision of assistance that is necessary.
Evelyn Ajwang is a nurse and midwife who also teaches family planning and reproductive health in small towns and villages in Kenya. We asked her about the obstacles faced by the women she works with.
Women in Kenya normally are not mostly economically empowered, so they depend mostly on men in terms of their livelihoods. So even whatever the woman would want to do, she has to get permission from the husband. So this would be a challenge mostly in terms of decisions on matters reproductive health. The husband has to agree with whatever she wants to do. And then the issues of myths and misconceptions surrounding reproductive health and family planning. For example, that when a woman is using family planning, either this woman will become infertile in future, which is not true, it's a myth. When you use family planning, you can deliver an infant with the malformation. These are myths that are going around within the community that is affecting uptake among women of reproductive age. We realized that men were not well conversant with issues of contraceptives and also family planning. They were very green and ignorant. So what we did is we targeted men with information. Then they were realizing, hey, if we plan our families, then the health of this woman would be better. And also we are telling them that when you have a larger family, your economic status is also not stable. The challenges on population, health, and environment are integrated. There's no way one can ever separate the three. Because with a larger population, meaning lesser resources available to these communities, then these people will be using the available natural resources. The resources keep on depleting. There are some communities that don't allow women to plant trees. They were saying that when the women plant trees, then that would be a taboo. That community will be cursed and will be affected for a longer duration in terms of either deaths or them not receiving rainfall. When you empower a woman, you empower a whole community. Because when you give knowledge to this woman, and this is something that is factual, we've seen it, this woman is able to deliver this information to the whole community, and this thing will spread.
That was Evelyn Ajwang, a nurse and midwife in Kenya. She manages a maternal, neonatal, child health, and family planning program for Pathfinder International. That was in Kenya, and Musimbi's in Kenya. But I want to ask Corrine, as Americans listening to this might think, oh, these are issues or challenges for women in countries that I don't know where they are on a map, and I'm probably not going to go there. How do you see some of those issues as relevant to the communities you work with in New Mexico in the United States?
So when we talk about this memory of seeds, not only those that we plant in the ground, but those that we carry as women, the memory of those seeds continues to be things that we need to nurture and things that are influenced by the social, economic surroundings of all of us, our societies and our communities. We talk about that in particular because of historical trauma, intergenerational trauma, and individual complex trauma that we know passes through generations and passes through seeds as well. So my sister was talking about maize and corn and drought-resistant seeds, and we know as communities that grow up in these environments where they are challenged by different seasonal fluxes, rains, droughts, that our seeds learn this. Our seeds are remembering. And so those seed resistant and drought resistant seeds exist. And those have been taken away from communities like the Philippines, like Africa, where people wanted to give monocropping, right? Give certain seeds that don't germinate after just one cycle. They're not fertile after that. We have corn sizes and varieties that come from all across the world that are tiny, that are really, drought resistant to those, we see big yellow corn. But that diversity helped to sustain all of our communities across the globe. And when we talk about reproductive justice and needing to nurture the seeds of our women, research has shown us that women carry the seeds of their grandchildren, right, already in our being. And so when we talk about the impact on generations because of climate change, because of other contaminations that may come to our communities, and as I speak as a Tewa woman from my community that at one point in history was down to 100 people. So I don't want to say lightly that reproductive issues are, just this, and this. They are about understanding that complex history and understanding the impositions of other people's religions and beliefs on other people's. And how do we recognize the humanness and the humanity of all of us?
Musimbi, you have a doctorate in feminist theology. Does addressing climate change mean sort of attacking patriarchy, some of the deep-rooted systems? We often talk about climate change as solar and wind and types of energy and power. Is there a different type of power, gendered power, male power and dominance that Corrine just talked about? Should that be part of the climate conversation?
Yes, it should be. Talking about any feminist, whether they are coming on it to it from a social perspective, from a secular, from a theological perspective, etc., really talks about justice. And one way for us to be able to ensure justice for women is to be able to address patriarchy, because we are all victims of patriarchy. Patriarchy is a system, and it's a system that gave privilege to male persons and underprivileged the female persons. We as women and men are all victims of it, and we need to be able to speak out against it, to be angry about it, and to find ways in which we can be able to right what is wrong in regards to equality. And I think many people are working on this from many aspects of their lives. And in climate change, as well as in the areas of sexual reproductive health, we cannot be able to get to the right answers without also addressing patriarchy. I do want to say some things that can be also confusing, which Corrine has talked about, and I agree with everything that she has said about misusing women's bodies from outside without them having their own voice to decide on what is best for them. It's a difficult area, but when we think of sexual reproductive health for women, we think of it in terms of many different directions. I have learned by working for many years with Global Fund for Women, working with other organizations that address women, etc., that the health issue for women is important. If we are able to say, for example, in Africa, we say that 89% of all women in the informal sector supporting the most important aspect, food on the table, kids, etc. And if we are able to say things like 80% of farmers in Africa are women, how are they going to be able to run their work if every year, every 9 months, they have another child? It impacts on their health, their ability to be able to work. Women spend on the continent of Africa, for example, 40 hours a week on just fetching water alone before they even do the other jobs that they have to do. So when we talk about making accessibility, reproductive health for women, we want women to be safe and to be healthy. And this covers many ways. It may cover family planning, which might be about spacing kids or deciding when a woman wants to have a child and with whom, so that it's not forced. It might be about pre or postnatal health. It might be about contraception. It might be about having access to safe abortion. It might be about ability to get the information, age-appropriate information at the right time. Currently, I just want to say I'm very inspired by the courage of young people, because young people are able to see quite a lot of how these things are interconnected. And I think that we should invest in women and the leadership of women to be able to get the differences that my sisters on the panel have talked about. But we should also invest in young people and in the education of young people. And I see through the colleges that we work within the United World Colleges, many young people are really providing leadership in these areas. And because they come to these areas without the stigmatization and patriarchy, without being extremely rooted in patriarchy in the way in which older generations have been rooted in, they really can be a future that opens up some place that we could go to that is a better place than where we are today.
Podcasts of this and other Climate One shows are available wherever you get your podcasts. Please help us get more people talking about climate by giving us a rating or review. It really does help. Thanks for joining us online. We'll see you next time, everybody.